A debate. We're wondering if they're proceeding with a little bit more caution than they were before. The world leaders who at the beginning of the week were ramping up for intervention against Syria after last week's chemical attacks in the suburbs of Damascus. With us to talk about it from Washington, Bilal Saab of the Institute for Near East and Gulf Military Analysis. Here in the studio, he commanded UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and Bosnia. General Dominique Trinquant, welcome back. Welcome back as well to Amr Abed Rabo, and Franco-Syrian photojournalist. And from Moscow, former vice chair of the Russian Parliament's International Affairs Committee, Natalia Narochnitskaya of the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation. Welcome back to all four of you. Just before the break, we were talking about the specter of Iraq in 2003 and the US-led invasion there. Well, that's something that's been on the mind of James Creedon. Let's say hello to him. How are you, James?
Not too bad, Francois.
Time for a look at our media buzz segment here on this issue.
Absolutely. And the New York Times today came out very strongly and said more answers needed on Syria. Now, you mentioned Iraq. Maybe Iraq was foremost on the New York Times' mind in writing that editorial piece. They said there is no evidence showing Assad was behind a chemical weapons assault. Given America's gross failure in Iraq, where the Bush administration went to war over non-existent nuclear weapons, the standard of proof is now unquestionably higher. And if you check out this editorial here, Francois, from 2004, The Times and Iraq, they said, looking back, we wish we had been more aggressive in re-examining the claims as new evidence emerged or failed to emerge. So I think they're particularly cautious when it comes to issues such as this, where maybe the evidence isn't crystal clear in linking Assad to chemical weapons.
And the other issue, obviously, on this, we mentioned at the beginning of the show, The Economist, which it's not blinking.
It's not blinking at all. It's interesting. I went back to find their editorial for the Iraq war, the case for war, where they said Mr. Hussein needs to be removed before he gets his bomb. Well, it looks like they haven't changed their standard, if you like, and they're still, hit him hard is what they're saying, as you were showing a little while ago. Assad's apparent use of chemical weapons, they say apparent use, but then they go on to say if an American missile hits him, so be it. So that's a slightly different attitude to the New York Times. Also interesting to look at the New York Post.
Rupert Murdoch on paper.
Target Assad, they're being pretty clear about it. Now, what about the British press? This is a piece in The Spectator, and it shows David Cameron there looking rather pleased with his military toys. They point out that when he was in opposition, he said, and I quote, "Bombs and missiles are bad ambassadors. They win no hearts and minds. They can build no democracies." And certainly he's become a lot more hawkish in power. They spoke to one military source who said, "We were worried in the military about overstretching the UK military in Libya." He overrode those concerns, and now he's sort of trying to override those concerns again. At some point, we might have to learn a Suez-style lesson, pointing to the Suez War, where Britain came out of that badly.
Often the case of military is more cautious, and General Trinquant won't disagree with me, more cautious than the politicians.
Certainly in this case, they're saying that maybe British politicians will have to learn the hard way. Now, just one or two other British articles. This is in The Times, where a government source, UK government source, apparently called Mr. Miliband, and this is the headline in the Huffington Post. I'll leave you read that for yourself.
Okay.
They basically said that he is a beep,
family
beep,
show,
beep.
James.
Yes, because he's waiting for the UN inspection report. It's pretty extraordinary that a government source would resort to expletives merely because an opposition leader is waiting for a UN report. I find that pretty amazing. Now let's move to Le Monde. Their editorial today couldn't be more critical, really, of Vladimir Putin. What they said essentially was, if I can find it here, is that Russia and Putin diplomacy bear a huge part of the responsibility for the Syrian regime breaking the taboo over using a weapon of mass destruction. And they go on to say a mix of paranoia and re-Sovietization has seen Russia oppose the West wherever it can. And so a huge part of the responsibility lying on Putin's doorstep, according to Le Monde. So that's pretty strong. And just maybe finish in terms of Putin on this, Francois, that's in the New York Times. Putin's silence on Syria suggests his resignation over intervention. He has said nothing publicly on.
So he's thrown in the towel and he thinks that there's going to be intervention. Natalia Narochnitskaya, we know that the Russian president's been on the phone with the German chancellor this Thursday, but he hasn't spoken out publicly. Do you agree with the New York Times says that, well, maybe there is in the high halls of power in Moscow a bit of quiet resignation that it is going to happen?
Well, no, I have no information with regard to this dilemma. But, you know, Russia is knowing very well the Islam world because Russia has been having long ago a very deep and profound Oriental studies. We know better than anyone else what the implications and consequences of this act, if it happens, I mean the strike, on the whole region and Islam world. There will be chaos uncontrolled, no matter how much this control the United States and the British can claim. And Europe would be the first victim because all the terrorists who long ago took over this battle, I have seen some, they will spread out, ruining Lebanon, Jordan, Tunisia, Egypt, and the flood of this will radicalize the French Muslim community and the British Muslim community.
And sorry, Natalia, but how will Moscow react if there are strikes?
Well, our foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, said that we will not fight with anyone. So I can only quote this, although my personal opinion is that if there is the slimmest chance to postpone or to have second thoughts about it, it must be used by our country to negotiate this secretly, not publicly, no matter how, but for the sake of even such peace as we have now, compared to what chaos we will have after that.
Okay.
So.
James Creedon, let me just one final point from you then on this.
Well, just very quickly, Francois, you can see on social media, as is often the case, it's a pretty pacifist medium often, except when it's used by the army, I suppose. You can see the anti-war campaign building. This is just one example of a hashtag that's been very much used today on the French French version of Twitter, No à la guerre en Syrie. And that's getting about 10 messages every minute. So a lot of people feeding into that sentiment, no to a war in Syria.
All right, James Creedon, many thanks for that.
Thanks, François.
And keep us posted.
Sure.
Now, we were talking a moment ago about exhausting the diplomatic channels, proceeding with caution. Proceeding with caution, that's part of the message of the piece that you co-authored for Foreign Policy, Bilal Saab. In it, you say, given the deaths of hundreds of civilians when the United States bombed the Amaria shelter in Baghdad in '91, as well as the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, American targeteers had better be sure they know what not to hit in Damascus this time around. Bilal, we're talking about very heavy populated areas. There are claims that the Republican Guard has already moved troops and hardware away from the main barracks. What would airstrikes target?
That was a point, Francois, to illustrate the risks, basically, of targeted campaigns. They're only targeted in name. It is more likely going to be comprehensive and hard. The policy of this administration, let's not forget that, is still to push for a political settlement between the government and the rebels. What they're trying to do to advance that goal is to supply the rebels with weaponry. And most recently, there's been a large quantity of ammunition and light weapons that was transferred from the Turkish border to Syria. And then in addition to that, it's possible that the United States will launch airstrikes against Syria. But the goal is still to push for a political settlement. They're trying to force Assad to come to the negotiating table with a relatively weaker bargaining position, and the rebels with a much stronger bargaining position. But this is not, again, to push for the collapse of the regime, and the president himself has mentioned it. Can you ignore the risks of escalation in Syria? Only a fool would do that. But a bigger fool would ignore the consequences of inaction in Syria. And you already have, like I said, a death toll of more than 100,000 people and millions of people who have fled their homes.
So again, how does Barack Obama keep his promise? How does he keep those airstrikes limited? What does he target, Bilal?
Look, the likely targets are command and control centers, military sites, regime buildings, strategic weapons and strategic delivery systems. But my point is, and this is where I criticize the policy, is that it's not realistic to go for limited airstrikes against Syrian targets because, like you mentioned, and that's only one part of it, there are a lot of densely populated areas in Syria, and a lot of the strategic weapons, also the chemical sites, are very close to civilian buildings and where innocent people live. So my point is that the military objective of the administration is not realistic, and I think that it will automatically lead to escalation. So you might as well go in with a much more comprehensive plan that would achieve the goal of actually deposing the regime. I don't think it's possible to do the two things at the same time. Keep him in place while pushing him to go to the negotiating table.
General Trinquant, all or nothing? Do you agree?
No, I think that you can change the balance of power inside Syria, and the main targets, contrary to what has been said, is air defense system and aircraft.
Can you strike enough to bring both sides to the bargaining table?
I think if you destroy part of the air power of President Assad and the air defense system, he will know that he's at the same level to fight on the ground with the opposition. And at this stage, perhaps, with a strike, he will go back to discussion, perhaps. But as President Hollande said this morning, the opposition must be ready to discuss also. That's the point. So help a bit the opposition, but not make the job for the opposition. And then the two will gather around the table. That's the hope.
Which brings us back to the point that you made in part one about how the tide you believe Ammar has already
that's
turned.
not realistic.
You were in Aleppo at the end of July, sorry, the middle of July. What gives you that impression?
Well, you could see, I mean, since Qusair, that without the Hezbollah, without the air or the Air Force, on the ground, the Syrian army is weak, is losing ground, is not winning anything alone. It has to have the support of Lebanese militia or of Iranian advisors or maybe of Russians. They cannot do anything alone anymore. That's finished. So that makes me say that they lost the ground battle. But for what the general said, I'm always scared. You know, I believe a lot in proverbs, and there's this famous proverb, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm always scared that such strikes that are not really, that come maybe too late, too little, and we don't know exactly, I mean, they're very shy strikes. They might be much better for Assad propaganda. I can tell you from now, whatever Bilal said, that there will be some civilians killed, because the Syrian regime will make it very possible that Syrian civilians will be killed in any strike, even if they're very accurate and precise. And so, of course, they will get the cameras of all over the world, and you may have also demonstrations in Paris saying we don't want to kill Syrian babies, you know. So it's very complicated, it's very touchy. We have to be very careful about what we're doing, and if we go, we have to go all the way. We cannot go like half-half.
Can't go half-half, which is, I guess,
never said there won't be civilian casualties, François.
What's that?
I never said there won't be civilian casualties. I actually said that it's unrealistic to expect such surgical attacks without collateral damage.
We agree.
But to the point of air defenses, there's no way you're going to be able to wipe out the entire network with the weapon of choice, which is standoff weapons, basically fired from fighter jets outside of Syrian airspace, or Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from the sea, or from B-2 bombers. There's no way you can do that except actually mount a comprehensive air campaign inside Syrian airspace.
Syrian president, by the way, this Thursday, reportedly speaking, he, according to state media, warning that if there is a strike, he won't sit idle.
The threats of direct aggression against Syria will only increase our commitment to our deep-rooted principles and the independent will of our people. Syria will defend itself in the face of any aggression.
Bashar al-Assad speaking there, you saw in those images, reportedly speaking there, but you saw in those images in the company of a delegation from Yemen. If we look at neighboring countries, we can ask the question of what retaliation would look like. You see Syria strategically located, right at the heart there of the region. It has a border with Turkey, with Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. With Iraq and Iran, of course, on the other side. When you look at that map, you do have to understand why it's so difficult to make this decision that the Western leaders have to make.
There's no doubt about this, but again, I think it's Bilal or the general who said that doing nothing is even worse. So. What is, I mean, when you look at the map, doing nothing is even worse because there is already troubles in Iraq, there's already troubles in Turkey, there's already troubles in Lebanon, and maybe Jordan is on the way. I mean, so what? We just stay there and say, oh, it's very risky, so we don't move?
All right, we're just getting a word from the White House press spokesman saying that what it's contemplating, I'll get your reaction, Natalia Narochnitskaya, the White House is saying that what it's contemplating will be a discreet and limited. Your reaction to that statement?
Well, that only reflects that the American leaders, after declaring their desire and using this as pretext, now are thinking about the consequences and the realistic parameters of the proposed thing. And if we say that the purpose is to put onto the table, to force to the table of negotiation, Assad many times declared he was ready. But who will negotiate on the other side? The opposition, which exists on paper, and the groups of armed extremists who are not controlled by anyone, who are under drugs and they're seeking no democracy but Sharia law. They're cutting, heads, etc. So that is the second thought that we must think about, because if we destroy even that balance that there exists, nobody, no opposition existing on paper and having no real power, no real control over the armed groups of extremists who came from now various places. That is the problem. That is the problem. Who will win if Assad is destroyed by Western attack? Who will win and who will control? It would be worse than now.
It'll be worse than now. Before I get your reaction, Amar, the unintended consequences of a strike include a power vacuum that could favor jihadist militants fighting Assad. Just ask some of the 44,000 Kurdish refugees who've poured across the Syrian border into Iraq in the past 2 weeks.
My people are facing a lot of pressure from the FSA. They believe they have the right to forcibly marry our women, and a lot of Kurds have been threatened with murder. We are getting the worst from all sides. We have no work and our life is difficult. That's why we came here.
Amar, what's your reaction to what that refugee was saying?
I really want to react to what Natalia was saying just before, if you allow me to. If Assad's hand was twisted a year ago, and if there was any sort of real action, I'm not talking about military strikes, but any real action to support the revolution people and to twist Assad's hand, we wouldn't be here today. We would not have today all these horrors that people are talking about, the jihadists, the I don't know what. And also I really want to insist, because as you said, I was in Aleppo a few weeks ago, I really want to insist that putting the revolution people as foreign jihadists only, that are really just a tiny minority. So putting all the revolutionaries as the foreign jihadists is propaganda, is a lie. And I cannot accept anyone saying something like this without knowing what's happening on the ground.
Natalia?
Well, I'm the one who organized side event during the Geneva session of the United Nations Human Rights Council with the presence of Ms. Navy Pillay and some ambassadors too, and who brought witnesses from the provincial places in Syria. For me, as NGO, it was important to have one criteria. There should not be in any case connected with the government to be credible before the audience we convened. And there was a sheikh, over 3 million people representing Muslim leaders, Catholic leaders from there, oppositional representative who even spent in Assad prison for 2 years, and they witnessed and testified that a lot of atrocities were perpetrated not by the army, although these episodes were allegedly declared that is a result of the army raids, and they were all saying that peace was still possible if the West would not support the Bolsheviks. And they all were warning that time has passed when opposition was an opposition. Now it's all extremists and Bolsheviks who have nothing to do with the ideals of democracy, and they just killing. And the army was winning more support by the population than it has before. Because it's still much better.
Let me get you to now. Let me get you in that in light of what Natalia was saying.
They're not angels, of course. I'm not at all trying to say they're angels at all. À la guerre comme à la guerre.
But let me just say, Amar, let me get Amar's reaction here to what that refugee was saying. We're sick of the Free Syrian Army harassing us, that Kurdish refugee was saying.
It might be possible to have local, isolated excess or abusive. That does happen.
This is more than a local, isolated incident.
It's war.
We've seen
it's war.
tens of thousands of people cross into Iraq.
We just listened to one person. A lot of people are also escaping the shelling. They're not escaping rapes, you know. So we have to be very careful about this. And I want to tell Ms. Natalia something very important. There are maybe 200,000 people who have been arrested, detained. We know nothing about them. I'm sure they're being tortured. Unfortunately, there are no cameras to see what's happening. There are no witnesses who will tell us what's happening to them. And the witnesses cannot go to Geneva to tell her what is happening. That's the main difference also with what's going on in the rebel areas. People talk.
Before we go, I got 2 questions on timelines. And I'm going to put the first one to you, General Tankon. Right now, the UN inspectors, those chemical weapons inspectors, are in Damascus. They're due to leave Saturday. How fast will we hear from them, and how does UN time work?
UN time work is not fast, but I guess that the P5 will pressure the Secretary General to make his report, because there is a second date which is important, the opening of J20 on Wednesday next week in St. Petersburg. And I guess that the P5 will want to discuss the subject on Monday. So I guess that the report should be ready on Monday to be discussed at the Security Council.
You've preempted me here, General, because I was going to put to Bilal Saab this question. That second clock which is ticking, the countdown to the G8 and G20 in St. Petersburg, Russia. It is 1 week from today. Does that mean that we're going to have conclusions and airstrikes between now and then? Or does that mean that this whole thing is going to blow over for the time being?
That's a good question. I mean, it's certainly going to be awkward having a meeting at the G20 in Russia that is preceded by U.S. airstrikes in Syria. I don't think that any airstrikes will be launched before that meeting. But on the job of the chemical weapons inspectors, let's just say that they actually come up with controvertible evidence that there was use of chemical weapons. So we go to the United Nations Security Council, and we can still have any attribution, basically, in terms of who used them. And then the Chinese and the Russians still veto any Chapter 7 resolution. So we're back to square one. I think that no matter how you spin this, there will not be a legal basis behind any intervention. So the Americans and the British and the French might as well just be on the same page and go about it with a coalition of the willing, because at the United Nations Security Council, it's a dead end. There's no way it's going to happen, legally speaking, international law speaking.
All right, that's Bilal Saab's prediction. Thank you for joining us from Washington. We want to thank Natalia Narochnitskaya for joining us from Moscow, and here in the studio, General Dominique Trinquant and Amar Abed Rabo. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.